Hey, thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to talk for the next 39 minutes and 55 seconds about investing in critical infrastructure. Many of us have come out of the fires of bipartisan infrastructure law implementation and are now in the midst of fighting for the lives of the projects that we spent the last 4 years teeing up for success. And we're going to reflect on that a little bit, and then we'll talk about the challenges that infrastructure in the country faces generally, and get into some of the nitty-gritty of what it means to have resilient critical infrastructure. So let me introduce my fellow panelists here. All the way at the extreme right, we have Brian Regli.
Not politically, just geographically.
So he says. You never know these days. Executive Director of Critical Investments for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and a longtime friend of Josh Shapiro, who competes with his wife for Brian's affections. That's Governor Josh Shapiro, apologies. Quentin Palfrey in the middle, Director of Federal Funds and Infrastructure for Governor Maura Healey of Massachusetts, and alumnus of the Obama White House, and Kate Gasparro, the CEO of Building Better Cities, a thought leader in transformational urban development, whose day job is working for the city of Pennsylvania, making the nation's largest water reuse project come to life. What did I say?
Pennsylvania.
Oh my God.
We'd love to have her too, but she's in San Diego, which is much prettier, admittedly.
San Diego. So let's start with a sort of high-level question. You know, infrastructure in this country faces the twin challenges of decades of underinvestment and a rapidly changing climate that stresses even modernized infrastructure. So what does resilient infrastructure mean to you in the 21st century? Let's start with Brian.
So I think you've got three major factors, right? You need an infrastructure that's intelligent, the extent to which we can use the modern tools that are available to us to determine maintenance routines all the way through use patterns, through smart deployment of technologies. I think you need an infrastructure that's increasingly intelligent. You need an infrastructure that's cost effective, and sometimes those two compete with each other, especially when you consider the third. You need an infrastructure that's sustainable from an environmental perspective, but also from a use perspective. And balancing those three become a real tricky equation. And I think all four of us on this stage are fanboys and girls of Ezra Klein and are in the middle of reading Abundance. And if you haven't read it yet, I'm not here to advertise the book, but all of those challenges that he and Derek Thompson, I think, correctly characterized are the ones that all of us deal with every day, because ultimately you're trying to get all three of those priorities, you know, expressed in every single project that you work on.
When?
So climate change is, you know, a sort of civilization-defining challenge that creates an extraordinary number of sort of challenges for states and cities as we try to figure out how to decarbonize, as we think about how to build clean energy, as we think about the resilience needs. We have, in states like Massachusetts, an enormous number of challenges around housing. Our transportation is woefully outdated, and under COVID, we had very significant challenges in terms of operating expenses. We're trying to get internet for everyone. We're trying to get clean water. And collectively, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and CHIPS and Science represented the largest investment in infrastructure in world history. The Inflation Reduction Act is the largest climate bill in world history. And so we're coming out of a period of time where there were an extraordinary number of resources to be able to target some of these civilization-defining challenges. And then in the last 4 months, there has been an equally dramatic set of challenges and obstacles facing infrastructure investment. And I think a lot of us are facing sort of the whiplash of moving from a world in which we were trying to leverage these these extraordinary new resources to take on challenges that we thought they were barely adequate for, to moving into a world where those resources aren't available and these challenges seem even more larger obstacles to overcome.
Yeah, I think, Quentin, you're spot on, because resilience we typically think of in this environment of climate resilience. But now we're thinking about an entirely different type of resilience, is political resilience and structural resilience. So how are we building into our infrastructure in the pre-planning phase that type of longevity so that they can withstand administrative changes, objective changes, and at a city level, which is mostly where I've been working, you're dealing with that on a 2-year and sometimes a 4-year basis, where mayors are going to change, city council is changing, and these projects need to stay consistent. And to that effect, when I was working in Michigan, in Detroit, that's where I met Zach, I was tasked with building the sustainability plan for a large private real estate company known as Bedrock in an environment where we didn't recycle. And so when you're trying to bring climate resiliency to an ecosystem or to a community that doesn't have the same vernacular, you sort of have to start thinking about how you're pitching these objectives in a way that makes sense and creates value for all of your stakeholders. So that's what I think resilient infrastructure is creating this vernacular that touches all your stakeholders and makes sure that they feel bought into the project so that they are thinking in a long-term sense around the value creation that is in their own self-interest.
No, that's a great point. Let's talk a little bit about why we are where we are. I glossed over 50 years of underinvestment in infrastructure, but even with the investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we still weren't building fast enough. The federal government authorized billions of dollars for infrastructure in 2021, 2022, and as of the time of the presidential election, only a fraction of that infrastructure had actually been built and completed. So why is that?
We probably need a couple days to really get the answers to those questions. But I think the short version is we tried to do everything, but we forgot to do the thing, right? There's a thing that you need to build, and to build something requires a clear set of objectives and a directionality and an intentionality. Sometimes, and I think this is a challenge that we try to overcome in Josh Piro's office, that question of how do you serve all the constituencies that you want to serve. Every project can't serve every constituency. There are always trade-offs. The challenge is how do you manage those trade-offs? And I think what the governor's done very, very well is he's posited a set of reforms that allow us to permit and move things more quickly. There are capacities that we have at the state level that I think are more appropriate at the state level than at the federal level. So there's a point at which I think you have to trust the states. I think you have to trust local communities. Yes, they're going to make mistakes, but at the same time, if you build programs the right way, communities can adjust, and mistakes that are made can be rectified. And ultimately, people are going to recognize the challenges that they have, be they climate change, be they equity, be they need to enfranchise workers. All of those things that are much better directed from the bottom up rather than the top down. We're going to need to design infrastructure programs and funding streams that lean into that. And unfortunately, the money that's been given in 2021, 2022, 2023, I mean, the inflation continues to go up, the challenges to build continue to go up. So we're going to probably achieve only a portion of the revolution that we were hoping to achieve. So in the coming years, hopefully building again rather than tearing down, we're going to have to find program designs and funding streams that reflect that, be they P3s or be they other types of relationships that the federal and state governments can collaborate with the private sector on to deliver infrastructure solutions to citizens.
Anything else on that?
No, I mean, I would say that, building big things is hard. It doesn't need to be this hard. And I do think that, we've seen in other countries the ability, for example, to build out high-speed rail much more quickly, much more cheaply than we've been able to do that in the United States. And I think it's reasonable for us to think about what are the regulatory and bureaucratic obstacles that make it so hard and so slow to get big projects off the ground. And I think it is time for us to look at how do we more nimbly navigate the policy instincts that underlie the regulatory problems. In other words, it's not that we should get rid of consultation with tribes and endangered species impacts and some of the eminent domain issues and the regulatory impacts. You want to make sure that your levees will actually hold, so you need to give engineers time to build things the right way. At the same time, it takes way longer than it needs to. Inflation in the infrastructure space is very, very high, and so time is money, and money is a big obstacle to getting a lot of these things built. And so to the extent that we can remove some of these regulatory obstacles, we can build more housing, we can build more clean energy projects, we can get more mass transit and transit-oriented development. And so there's a real relationship and a real cost to the regulatory hurdles that we put in place to building important things quickly.
Yeah. I think one of the things we're trying to hit on is infrastructure needs infrastructure, and more so than that, it needs the right infrastructure. It needs the right capacity at the local and the state level to ensure that when a project is going through, it's able to transcend the silos of permitting and public finance and zoning reform. And sometimes finding that key person who understands that is the biggest challenge in moving a project forward. And when I was working in the city of San Francisco, the Office of Community Investment and Infrastructure became that hub for any sort of private development. So you came in through a public-private partnership, and as a private developer, you're going to deliver public works projects, but you're also going to deliver the real estate that benefited from those public works projects. And you needed an entity who understood the infrastructure investment side and the real estate investment side, and could also get you through CEQA and NEPA, get you through Buy America policies, could help you understand the project labor agreement that was necessary for this. And that takes a consolidated effort of the right infrastructure to support these projects.
Now look, we can't let Zach off the hook here, because Zach, who didn't get a chance to introduce himself, did a lot of the work that Quentin and I do for Gretchen Whitmer up in Michigan. So you should now answer your own question, right? How do you feel about our progress in infrastructure, and what do you think's holding us back?
Yeah, it actually is a great transition to my next question, so thank you, Brian.
No, you can't avoid the question, though. You have to answer it.
No, I mean, I think you're all right. We have to move more quickly, but I think that means we have to be willing to prioritize and say what we actually want to build, right? So what the former president did at the end of his administration to say, you know what, semiconductor manufacturing in the United States is a critical national security priority, and for that reason, it is exempt from the National Environmental Policy Act. That's exactly the kind of decision that we need to make. Right. To your point, Quentin, and I might disagree with you just, in the mildest possible way, I don't think it is the Environmental Policy Act or CEQA that forces engineers to make sure the levees hold. I think that's their job, and we should let them do their job, right? And so I am skeptical that we are actually enhancing the quality of our infrastructure projects through some of these regulatory hurdles that we've built. And so to transition to the next question, it's not just that the regulatory hurdles are slowing down projects, it's also that we are building less with the money we have, right? A highway project in the United States costs 3 times as much now than it did in 1960. And Zachary Liskow and Leah Brooks have studied why that is. And in short, it's a combination of people in the US are wealthier, and wealthier people want nicer roads. That's part of it. It's that our regulatory processes are taking more time because they are so responsive to litigation, and the litigation itself slows us down, and preparation and prophylactic work to prevent litigation slows us down. Environmental processes didn't used to yield unequal outcomes, but now they yield unique benefits for wealthy communities, and that means that we have to build nicer amenities, sound walls, more green space in order to buy off those wealthy communities. And last, we've gutted state agencies And in so doing, we have not saved money, but we have made it impossible to control public spending because of the quality of public staff has slipped, meaning we have less ability to control state contractors. So costs are rising. How do we continue to build projects that are responsive to community needs in light of that? We can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, you know, back to Robert Moses. Let's do the power broker again. So what do we do? What replaces that model?
I gotta tell you, Zach, I wish I could bottle the response you just gave and like bring it to every other meeting that I have, right? I mean, I think the way you've scoped it out is absolutely brilliant. And the Robert Moses, extra credit on the Robert Moses reference, right? For everybody in the room, right? But one of the points you made is really important. It's the human capital factor, right? We are in a world that's extraordinarily complex, and anybody who comes to this conference, you know, Smart Cities USA, just the name itself indicates, well, you gotta be really smart to manage a city. The world is becoming more and more complicated, so experts sometimes fail, and the depth of expertise required to do something now is much more vast than it was in 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, because you're trying to accomplish so much. So it's really important at the state and local level that we educate, that we learn, that we give young people a chance to become enfranchised. One of the biggest challenges we have at the state is 30% of the employees today in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania are eligible for retirement, right? And now at the federal level, we are laying off tens and thousands of people that actually do have experience and actually know what the heck they're doing in many, many cases, right? Admittedly, not all, but in many. So this brain drain that you're going to get in the bureaucracy is going to slow us down even further. I think the most important thing to figure out is how do we invest in the people that are going to help make these projects real, and how do we teach them, and how do we bring them into communities of service that then value the work that they do. If you can build with your people, you can build anything. And ultimately right now, I think that that's an area of value that we need to do a lot more work in.
Yeah, I mean, infrastructure investment, or at least good infrastructure investment, has huge returns on investment, and failing to do it can cause really significant headwinds. If you don't have enough housing, if your transportation infrastructure doesn't work, people leave, they can't stay, they don't build careers and families in your jurisdiction. So it's really, really important to do. But it's really expensive. And there are some unique headwinds, I think, facing infrastructure investment right now. So at the beginning of COVID, a lot of the transit agencies had decreases in ridership. They had huge operating gaps. And so the cities like New York and Boston and a bunch of the places that have big transit agencies, first of all, were starting at a huge deficit. Then you've got a state of grid repair backlog, and Zach referred to decades of underinvestment, but the result of that is that there are a lot of bridges and roads and culverts that are falling apart, and where you kind of have to run to stand still to even catch up with that. There was a huge federal investment with the BIL and IRA and CHIPS, but the discretionary grant environment under this Congress and the Trump administration is going to be a lot less fortuitous for investing. Some of the formula money may well decrease as the Trump administration and Congress try to find money for those tax cuts. And so the federal investment in either operating or capital is likely to be less fulsome in the next couple of years. But there's a second order problem here, which is that if there are cutbacks on things like Medicaid, it's going to starve some of the state budgets, right? And so the state budgets are not necessarily going to be able to backfill the federal government sort of grant-making investments. And what that means is that we've got a lot of work to do and very little appropriated or discretionary grant money to do it with. And I think where that takes us is that we're going to have to be a lot more nimble about thinking about how to do other forms of financing, building infrastructure banks on the public side, getting equity investors, and thinking more creatively about public-private partnerships, thinking about some of these regulatory reform steps to bring the prices down, Putting a lot more what I might call TA or technical assistance, but what I don't mean is just sort of we need a grant writer, we need somebody to do design and engineering, but really sort of thinking creatively about which of these projects need which inputs, how do we work together as a community to move some of these things forward? Because we're not just going to be able to take a huge amount of federal money or a huge amount of state money and just throw it into these projects. We're going to be a lot more nimble and creative than that, I think.
I kind of want to take it from the other direction. So we talked about how state offices are going to be deploying or are going to have a difficult time deploying capital into these projects. And a page out of the community development playbook is, can we look at where communities want their infrastructure in the first place? Can we flip the script instead of saying, let's look at these large projects? Memphis, for example, back in 2014, decided to crowdfund, one neighborhood decided to crowdfund their own bike lane and signal to the city, this is the infrastructure that we need in our community. And so it was a clear signal that allowed the city to say, hey, there'll be less community opposition if we deploy pedestrian bicycle infrastructure in this area. Then we saw in Michigan deploy an entire, I would say, campaign to match crowdfunded dollars in communities that were looking to enhance community spaces like parks, like bike lanes, like community centers, where you're taking a page out of the playbook of the communities themselves, what are they looking at, and can we use that to leverage how we're deploying funds in a way that, to your point, cuts down on the community opposition and some of these cottage industries that are leveraging community opposition to blow up a NEPA process. If I take that one step further, there's an opportunity this year in Baltimore, Prince George's County P3 for public schools is allowing the private investment to crowdfund equity from the community, and it's restricted only to those within the zip codes that are being impacted by these schools. So that is not just a way to have the community signal what they want, but to actually benefit on the same timeline that private investors are for these large infrastructure projects that are transforming communities. So I guess we're trying to talk about how we get more dollars in to these projects, which usually brings in consortiums from Europe or from Asia that have large infrastructure dollars they want to invest on stable returns in US infrastructure. But what if we were to deploy the same opportunity to communities such that we align the benefits that they'll see on a day-to-day basis, driving on a new roadway, going to a new school, in the communities in which they're actually benefiting? And is that an opportunity for us to align and mitigate some of the community opposition we're seeing that leads to these exorbitant costs for our large infrastructure projects?
Thank you. I want to pick up I want to double down on public-private partnerships in a moment, just pick up on something you said, Quentin, about planning and about technical assistance. One, so I was the Chief Infrastructure Officer for Governor Whitmer, which meant not only that we were galvanizing state agencies to pull down the maximum number of dollars, but we were also creating resources for Michigan communities to grab a disproportionate share of dollars, and often found that they weren't where they needed to be on the ladder of readiness to actually win a federal grant. So I want to sort of warn any of the folks who talk to communities in the room, there's a danger in whipsawing between like the bipartisan infrastructure law moment of like, okay, now we're doing building, and the Trump era moment of like, okay, now we're doing Doge, and lose focus on what it is that the community needs and what we need to build in order to thrive in this century. And we ought to have such a clear vision of what that is that it actually doesn't change too much depending on who the presidential administration is. Kalamazoo had pulled down the highest number of dollars per capita among communities in Michigan, and that was because they had a master plan that philanthropy, economic developers, major corporations, and the mayor were all bought into. That's what cities should strive for regardless of who the president is. So I just want to make that pitch for I don't know if that's technical assistance, but planning and sort of stick-to-it-ness. You look like you want to say.
Yeah, no, and I think it builds on some of what Kate was saying about community engagement. So when Governor Healy came into office 2 years ago, she wanted to go really big on going after the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA and CHIPS money, and she built a whole new whole-of-government effort. And as part of that, we brought in about $9 billion to deploy across the state. But part of what we did as part of that was try to go out to cities, towns, and tribes and sort of ask them what they need. We built something that we call the Federal Funds Partnership, and we pretty consistently heard the same kinds of things. So they would say that there are too much jargon, too many silos, we don't understand these deadlines, we understand that this money is out here, but not how to use it. We saw that the wealthier communities, the big planning departments, or could hire consultants or had a big track record with engaging with federal grants, were way better equipped than others. And so even if you put equity as a priority, the reality was that unless you could actually help folks design a plan, and implement it, they weren't ready to apply for these grants. They couldn't turn them into real projects. And so as we've moved forward in this, we asked the legislature to be able to tap our rainy day funds. We have a $9 billion rainy day fund in Massachusetts. We didn't want to tap the actual equity of it because sometimes it rains, but we tapped the interest on it and put it in a fund, $750 million, to invest in these projects. And what we're doing with that is going out to communities, identifying priority projects. We're building out some lending vehicles. We're building out some additional technical assistance to try to drive forward these projects. But a big part of that is actually the community engagement piece of trying to design the projects, trying to overcome those obstacles, talk through some of these complicated financing things, and get it right from the beginning. So just having the money is not enough. You got to have a good plan. You've got to have good community engagement. You've got to figure out what you're actually trying to build.
All the other infrastructure czars are jealous of Quentin because he was able to grab the interest from his state's general fund. But in seriousness, it is brilliant because these budget stabilization funds are designed to protect the state in moments of crisis, but there's no crisis more expensive than infrastructure failure. So if you can take some of that money and guard against that possibility, you actually are making a very prudent investment. So I think folks, think about public-private partnerships for all kinds of reasons. Perhaps a sense that they may get a higher level of performance from the project. Perhaps a sense that it allows you to build something that the state alone could not finance. And perhaps a sense that it frees you from the management and maintenance responsibilities. And so you get all these different models, right? You have Chicago selling its parking meter infrastructure to a private equity company for, I don't remember what it is, 50, 99 years, something like that. You have major infrastructure companies building toll roads for you. You have, you've got companies buying up toll roads that are already built in Alabama and operating them for a profit. So under what circumstances do you see public-private partnerships as having the most impact? And why don't you each talk about a transformative project from your state?
Kate, why don't you start?
Okay. I'm actually going to start with Cleveland, which is not in the state I currently live. I used to work in Cleveland, Ohio, and helped establish a public-private partnership out there, transforming 35 acres on the Cuyahoga River, which used to be an old rail yard converted into a surface parking lot that sat dilapidated for many years. And I think to this point of cutting across administrations to overall objectives, Cleveland has struggled for a long time with talent attraction and retention to drive economic growth. And so as part of putting together this public-private partnership, we wanted to align objectives with the city itself. And I'm not talking about the mayoral administration, I'm talking about the population within Cleveland. Clevelanders wanted there to be a revitalized riverfront. They put together a master plan led by the planning department, and we saw that as an opportunity, sort of a foot in the door, to leverage the planning that has already been done, the objective that had already been set, and then align the fiscal tools around that. So if the goal was to drive economic development, then we were going to leverage tax increment financing and make sure that the value created from the original development that the private developer would take on would then go feed the private development. So it's not just aligning the goals, but can you align the financing around the goals and make sure that if the goal is economic development and the vehicle is a public-private partnership, that the revenues are directly derived from that economic development, which is what we were able to achieve with tax increment financing and value capture with an infrastructure and real estate play to transform 35 acres on the riverfront. And I'm excited to say that we pitched this project back in 2021 in July, and we broke ground in 2023 in October. And now, this year, they're starting construction for the first 2 buildings, a new bulkhead riverfront walk to really stimulate and catalyze the rest of the development of the 35 acres. So I think it's that alignment is a foundational role in how a public-private partnership makes sense in the first place.
So I'll tell you something I'm trying to do. So the legislation that I mentioned puts aside a chunk of money that could be used for lending. And what I'd like to do is create a new lending vehicle that will do 2 things. The first is to leverage the tax credits within the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act, although it had some big discretionary grant chunks at the front end of it, is largely a tax bill. And between now and 2032, the tax credit aspects, particularly for clean energy projects, particularly for cities, towns, tribes, museums, universities, nonprofits, could really be transformative for investments in solar, heat pumps, EV chargers, EV fleets. But there are some real challenges to that. You get the money back, potentially up to half of a project cost, depending on various kinds of escalators, if you understand the opportunity, if you put the money up front and can wait for 3 years, and if you're willing to take the risk that Congress doesn't screw it up, which, by the way, I don't think they're going to, but there's, there's a headwind there. And so one of the things I want to do is create a bridge lending vehicle, and Brian's given deep thought to this as well, and I've learned a lot from him on this, that would allow us to loan money for clean energy projects to bridge that gap and potentially make some of those loans forgivable under the circumstances where some of these, there are changes in Washington. So that's one thing I want to do. Another thing I want to do is some nimble microfinance for local infrastructure projects. So create a line of funding at very, very low interest rates with forgivability and other kinds of mechanisms that would allow local infrastructure projects to tap in under circumstances where they probably wouldn't be able to get the commercial markets to back those loans. So, the way to think about that is to combine it with the kind of technical assistance that I'm talking about and the kind of community engagement that Kate was talking about. Really go out into a bunch of communities, figure out what the highest value projects are, figure out what your administration, your gubernatorial administration actually wants to drive forward, and then loan money to fix those sort of projects. And so I think sort of collectively what that means is you sort of go out to the communities, explain to them what the federal opportunities are. You offer them as much state support as you possibly can and de-silo your state opportunities. And then you offer them technical assistance to work through some of the projects, design and engineering and grant writing and implementation, maybe some tax advice, and then you lend them money to make the finance plans work. I think if you can do all of that, you can de-risk some of these projects, and maybe you're not doing billions and billions of dollars of these large infrastructure projects. Those require a different kind of a financing play. But you can do a lot of local infrastructure projects that wouldn't otherwise happen that have a real impact on real communities.
I'm going to extend Quentin's remark and give you a specific example. We do not have a legislature with the generosity of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But we did actually get them to put $25 million towards a project called Solar for Schools. And in a couple weeks, the grantees for that program will be announced. There'll be about 35 schools in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that will receive grant money representing up to 50% of the value of what's required for a solar array. Now, we've been working closely with a group that the Heinz Foundation set up. It's called Pennsylvania Solar Center, that basically provides technical assistance to not-for-profits. So many of those schools used PA Solar Centers to help size the capacity for their particular installation and wrote a lot of the material that was required for the application. So you have that piece of technical assistance. Now, concrete example, right? One of the schools that is likely to be awarded, Western Pennsylvania, somewhat rural school, about an $800,000 solar array. They're going to get about $350,000 in the grant, most likely because of the nature of the rules. So now you have a gap of $450,000 you have to fill. If you know the IRA tax credits, it's $800,000. At 30% ITC investment tax credit, you're going to get $240,000 back. So you're getting, let's say again, $350,000 in a grant. You have $240,000 more that you're going to get back in a couple of years. You got to carry that, right? So now you have a much smaller equity gap that's required. Fortunately, the Heinz Foundation is willing to step in with an additional bridge loan to cover not just the amount of the tax credit that they're going to receive via the direct payment structure of the IRA, but also that small stub that's going to remain because this is a school that's underprivileged and it's in their catchment area. So although we weren't able to get the full amount from the legislature, we have the philanthropic community to lean in, and then also the solar installers that can provide some of the project financing along the way. So you can make a project like that work. Pennsylvania sucks at P3s. We do, right? I can talk about that for days, right? But we're really good at energy. Pennsylvania is the second largest exporter of energy in the United States. We're a driver of a lot of fascinating energy innovation. So this is an area where I think we as a state can really innovate, and our governor and our legislature has given us a little bit of leeway to do that. So I think that Quentin is absolutely right. It's those moments where you can point to those projects, and in many ways they have the chance to be transformative in a long-term fashion for local resiliency in particular. Because now you have local schools that are able to generate their own electricity. They have the resilience required for their battery backups. Their buses should be electric charged rather than diesel eventually. You can imagine a whole bunch of second and third order effects that are positive for local health and local community standards and everything like that. So there is still a very bright future, even during dark times, that if we continue to keep our heads down and working on those and build those partnerships from the ground up, we can do a lot of great things together.
All right, so we're running very low on time here. You have about a minute each left. There's a lot of ground left to cover. Why don't you each pick one change that you either want to see in the institutions that you work with that would make infrastructure delivery more effective, or one change in the way that your state is working with the federal government as a partner now that we have new leadership there, that we can look forward to in the coming years?
So I'm going to stick with energy because this is probably one of the few areas where we may have a certain degree of alignment in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with the Trump administration's desire to see more energy generated. And when you look at cost structures, there is a logic. The more output you can have in molecules and electrons, the more efficiently those molecules and electrons can be delivered to end users, the more we preserve the value of those through energy efficiency exercises, through investments in local capacity, the smarter we can make our grid in terms of its ability to load balance. All of that leads to well-functioning markets. But the challenge, as you can imagine, is that the electric utility industry, and not to criticize those leaders, it's extraordinarily hard to keep these grids functioning. You're still in these highly centralized, concentrated structures of dispatchable energy, where there's a power plant in the distance and it delivers, an electron to where we are here today. The reality is we have a distributed grid, a smarter grid. We have the ability to create demand response, even in these large data centers that are going to gobble up gigawatts and gigawatts and gigawatts. You might have seen that in Indiana, Pennsylvania, a county in the center of our state, yesterday was announced a $10 billion natural gas plant will be the largest natural gas power plant in the world, producing up to 8 gigawatts. We've been working with them for 2 years. The environmental community, I think, has concerns, and they should have concerns about what will this mean for emissions and what will this mean for the ecosystem. This is also an investor in hydrogen. This is also an investor in solar. This is someone who is building an all-the-above energy campus. And to create those kind of reliable islands that can support AI, while at the same time looking at this broader distribution of how energy can be generated and consumed and distributed and saved in Pennsylvania and nationwide? That is an important question for our future, where I do think there should be common ground. Energy policy has historically been common ground, even in the 70s and 80s when we were in crisis. So my hope is that we can find that common ground, figure out a way to build together, and figure out how to keep Pennsylvania moving in that direction.
I think that the public sector really struggles with the challenges of investing now for a huge benefit later, or investing now to avoid a huge cost later. So think about investment in semiconductors, right? So we used to build chips in the United States. Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley because we used to make them. And we used to have this iterative relationship between manufacturing technology and then developing the next waves of technology. The CHIPS and Science Act is based on the premise, both that there's a national security objective to making sure that we're building the next generation of technology here, but also that there's an economic competitiveness objective there. If we actually invest in the next wave of semiconductors, we're also building out the next generation of AI, quantum, cyber, 5G, and all of the jobs and industries of the future that emerge from that. That's a really good value proposition. That has the potential to create the jobs and the industries that are actually going to make sense for some of the high-cost places in the country like Massachusetts. But you've got to do the investment and then see the results over time. The opposite is true sort of on the resiliency side. The world is actually on fire, and our need to harden our infrastructure to deal with the flooding, the fires, the sea level rise, the huge impacts that we're going to see from climate change, not to mention transitioning our energy economy to solar and geothermal and wind. Those costs need to be expended now in order to offset much, much more significant damage down the road. But it's very hard to convince people to make the investment that will make that better when the pain of investing is now and the benefit is a cost that's avoided down the road.
I think both Brian and Quentin did an awesome job talking about the outcomes and the met objectives in both of their jurisdictions and with their constituencies. And I just have to think, as we're going through this larger federal transition, how we all need to be better about communicating the outcomes and objectives, but not just those two, it's also the process. There's this great research that came out of UCLA a while back that talked about stakeholders and constituents approve more of an outcome when they understand the process. Even if they don't agree with the outcome, as long as they understand the process and it was transparent to them how we went through it to get to the specific outcome, they're more trusting of the agency that's deploying the dollars, the developer that's bringing on the project. And I think in this environment of distrust and confusion around what is the process, how are these dollars actually leading to projects, we need to be better communicators, and it's not just the four of us up here, it's all of us in this room, about what are the true obstacles, what are the true processes, and what is the aligned objective we're all trying to work for. Because I think right now we're getting tossed around by all of the bipartisanship that's happening and the distrust between communities and their agencies, and not focusing on how do we make this as simple as possible, how do we ensure that the process is transparent and that everybody, even if they're not on board with the outcome or the objectives, understands what they are, so that we can better align not just our partnerships, but our financing tools around that. And we have 10 seconds left.
Hey, thank you guys all so much for these incredible insights. I learned a lot this panel, and I hope you guys all did too. Feel free to catch up with us wherever we might be the rest of the day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Zach.